New Zealand. Formed by the clash of continents, tectonic forces, and the passage of time. Here are landscapes shadowed by high mountain ranges and rainforest shrouded in mist. Running through this rugged beauty, powerful braided rivers split the wild coast. A land shaped by extreme nature. New Zealand, from above. For much of its length, the sparsely populated west coast of the South Island sits on a narrow shelf of land sandwiched between the Tasman Sea to the west and the Southern Alps to the east. The very things that make the area so beautiful also make it a challenging wilderness. Dense wet forest, fast-flowing rivers, high mountains, and overpowering isolation. Running almost the length of the South Island, the Southern Alps form a natural barrier between the east and west coasts, presenting a great wall of mountains, which sometimes appear to rise straight from the ocean. Until the middle of the 20th century, there were only rough tracks connecting the west coast to the eastern part of the island. And even today, the coast remains geographically isolated, confronted by the stormy Tasman Sea and challenged by extremes of weather. Here in the south, small communities have grown amidst the forests. A short road has been constructed, and a few of the rivers have been bridged. However, although the region covers almost 8% of the nation's total land area, less than 1% of New Zealand's 4.4 million inhabitants live here. West Coasters have a well-deserved reputation for being individualists, self-reliant, self-contained, and hospitable. Jackson Bay is located at the southern end of the coast and marks the start of southwestern Fiordland. In 1875, a small town was constructed here. However, the lack of a wharf prevented local industry from prospering, and after only a few years, most of the settlers moved on. Some, however, remain, buried here in the forest. Jackson Bay is home base for a number of fishing boats and often provides safe harbor for vessels seeking shelter from Tasman Sea storms. The Cray Pot is the southernmost cafe on the coast, and proprietor Meg Eade takes orders by radio from hungry fishermen as they approach the wharf.
Sure thing. I'll give you a call when it's ready.
Meg came to Jackson Bay on a visit, fell in love with the area, and decided to stay. Meg plays an important role in the tiny community, catering not only to locals, but also to the many travellers arriving at the southernmost end of the West Coast road network. The Tasman Sea, extending 2,000 kilometres to Australia, is a rich fishing ground. And when conditions are good, the crews make landfall only briefly, returning to sea as soon as possible. Braided rivers drain the mountains, flowing down wide valleys overlooked by rainforest as they run to the ocean. Some of these valleys are farmed for cattle, which are allowed to roam the wide open grassy flats. The steep valley walls form a natural barrier, making fences unnecessary. The jet boat was invented by New Zealander Bill Hamilton in the 1950s. These highly maneuverable craft are perfectly suited to shallow rivers and require only 7 to 8 centimetres of water when travelling at speed. Farmer J.J. Nolan and his wife Kathy check their cattle while boating up the Arafota River.
My father bought a jet boat about 1967, and ever since then we've used the jet boat as our farm runabout, come pack horse. We take all our gear and supplies and everything in on the boat. We cut our dogs in on the boat. I've even bought a crook horse out on the boat, so it's a big part of our farm as a jet boat. The river rules our life, and the weather. We don't mind working in the wet, but we have been caught coming out with cattle where the river's risen 2 to 3 feet in about 3 to 4 hours. So we've had to wait 2 or 3 days until the river drops and then come on back out. None of us have got neighbours really in the valleys, which is good, so it's pretty much run the same now as what it was 100 years ago. Used to do cattle drives out twice a year. It was about a 3-week trip to get the cattle to the market at Wataroa. It was a very hard place to farm, and it still is in some aspects because we are still isolated, even though we've got roads in and out. We're running about 500 plus cows, and majority of our cows are in the Arrawata Valley, so we winter all our cattle out here and we have our own cattle sale. South Western's still one of the few places left in New Zealand that's got traditionally bred cattle, and it attracts buyers from throughout South Island, even North Island, to buy our cattle. It's very, very natural, good cattle country, and they grow it well. There was never any question. It was always home, and South Western was a place where pretty much you knew you were going to end up.
The Southern Alps extend almost the length of the South Island, forming a barrier between the west coast and the eastern regions. The Haast Pass traverses the Southern Alps and was well known by early Maori. Mica schist rock in this area was commented on by geologist Julian von Haast when he followed this river in 1863. Between 160 and 200 million years ago, the sediments from which these rocks were formed lay at a depth of more than 10 kilometers, subjected to pressure and temperatures exceeding 300 degrees. About 105 million years ago, the schist moved to the surface. In 1960, the isolation of the west coast was finally broken by the Haast Pass Road, providing a vital link to the eastern South Island. In its lower reaches, the valley broadens, and the river spreads wide over the gravel flats. The Haast River flows out of the mountains. The land falls away, flattening on either side of the valley to reveal the southern end of Westland. Ahead, the river fans out, creating a gravel delta as it reaches the Tasman Sea. Knight's Point is 28 kilometres north of the Haast River. The Tasman Sea pounds the limestone cliffs, creating fantastic sculptural forms. Another major influence on the landscape has been seismic activity. The West Coast and Southern Alps geography is part of an ongoing collision between the Australian and Pacific tectonic plates. An expert on this process is Dr. Simon Cox.
The Earth has a series of plates in its outer layer. But in the South Island of New Zealand, we have two of the Great Plates, the Australian plate on the west and the Pacific plate on the east. And they're sliding pretty much side by side, but they're colliding a little bit. That collision is causing the buckling and the twisting of the Pacific plate upwards.
Both New Zealand and Australia were part of an ancient supercontinent, Gondwanaland. By modelling continental drift, we can see what happened as the landforms of Gondwanaland separated and moved apart. The red line indicates the position of the fault line as New Zealand formed. Beneath the surface of land and sea, these landforms rest on tectonic plates, and it's only in the last 5 million years that the Southern Alps have risen. A result of the buckling caused by the collision of these plates. Simon Cox demonstrates the tectonic forces with a very simple analogy.
The Australian plate is pushing against the Pacific plate, and the sand is representing the Pacific plate, and it's buckling and twisting and forming this pile of mountains, essentially. The sand forms a divide, it forms a crest which is parallel to the Alpine fault, and occasionally it cascades down in big rock avalanches down the faces of the mountains.
There are points on the Alpine fault which are of great interest to Simon.
At that site you've got incredibly young gravels, about 15,000 years old, which have got rocks immediately sitting on top of them that have come all the way from 25 kilometres down. And they've been uplifted by this push and movement along the fault. It's not doing it smoothly, it's doing it in earthquakes every few hundred years. New Zealand's plate collision is occurring at about 38 millimetres a year in the Southern Alps across the Alpine fault, and that's an incredible rate. That washes away the rocks and it shapes our geology. The rivers carry huge amounts of detritus out from them.